Years ago, we were making a trip to Gulf Shores, and we had been down there several times. And so we know how long the trip is, and the kids were much younger. Our oldest son, Andrew, was still in grade school. So we decide that to get down there, it's going to take us about 8 hours. And we'd left before at 6 in the morning, at 4 in the morning. This time we were going to leave at midnight and drive all night. The kids would be asleep. It would be great. Well, I'm going to sleep for a few hours. Well, about 10 o'clock p.m., I can't sleep. So I said, well, let's just go ahead and go. So we start driving through the Arkansas Delta, going into Mississippi, heading that way. And I look up and I'm a little drowsy. So it's about around 3 in the morning. We're in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. So we pull over, we go to a truck stop. My son, Andrew, gets out and goes in with me. And we're just kind of walking around trying to get awake. And he asked me, he goes, what time is it? And I said, it's 3. And he's like, there's a 3 o'clock in the morning? I said, yes, son, there is a 3 o'clock in the morning. So it was a learning experience. So we keep driving. We get to Gulf Shores. We get to the water. And there's a Denny's right on the beach. I said, well, let's go to Denny's. You know how you can tell you get somewhere early? You have to knock on the door for them to let you into Denny's. The manager's like, you want to come in? Yes, we'd like to come on in. So he lets us in, we eat. And I think, well, this is going well. This is really great. So we go by the place where it's in town that you can check into your condo. So we get there. It's like 9 o'clock in the morning. We're not supposed to be there till like 3. And I said, well, we're just going to check. Could we check in early? And click, click, click. Well, as a matter of fact, they're cleaning your place now. Yes, you can. So we swing by the grocery store, get some groceries, check in to the condo, put all the stuff up, and by 10 o'clock in the morning, we're on the beach. And by about 10:30 in the morning, I'm in a coma. But the kids are having fun. Marilyn's having a great time, and end up being a fabulous trip.
I want to thank Bill for sharing that story. Years ago, I suggested that we were going to drive through the night with our kids, and Bill said, let me tell you a story before you do that. But I appreciate that, and I love stories like that because we've all been there before. We've got a trip that we're about to start on that we are so excited. Everyone's looking forward to it, and it's that point of like, we can't leave soon enough. And so this morning, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at how Paul's first missionary journey begins. Because there are elements of that within Paul's story, where the beginning cannot come soon enough for Paul, but he's got to get through a few things, and we have to introduce a few characters as well. Now, I know it's the summer, but I've got a few maps that I'd like to show. These are normally the most exciting sermons that I do when I pull out the maps. But this morning, we are starting in Damascus, which is going to be that northeast of Jerusalem there, and the dots are going to indicate the directions that Paul heads in these trips, but to show you where we are. But we're in Damascus, and I want to introduce to you a character that I actually feel kind of bad for. Ananias comes onto the scene in Acts chapter 9. The text says, in Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias. Now, for all intensive purposes, Ananias is just a good dude who follows God. He listens to God. He is excited to do whatever God asks him to do. That is what we know so far about this individual is God speaks to him, and Ananias just says, how high? God, if you want me to jump, I'll jump. How high do you want me to go? I'm going to awkwardly fix this so everyone just look away. Okay. So, the Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias. He says, yes, Lord. Imagine if your kids said this to you the second that you called their name or anything. It's not what do you need? It doesn't sound like God has to say it 4 to 5 times before they eventually come to the room. It's God says, Ananias. Ananias says, yes, Lord. But here's what God commands. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarshish named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. Now, I'm not going to include the verses, the things, how Ananias responds, But if you're Ananias, place yourself in his sandals, I guess, technically is what he would be wearing. But place yourself in Ananias' sandals for just a moment. How would you respond to this? You are in the loop. You are a disciple of God. You know everything that's been happening in this community, the persecution, the intensity, the fear that a lot of people have been living with. And then you have this vision from God, and God says, the person that I want you to go talk to is the scariest person in your world that you can think of. And rightfully so, Ananias says, God, are you sure about this? Like you can kind of hear his voice go up a little bit with that concern. And Ananias kind of pushes back a little bit and says, God, maybe you haven't refreshed your browser. Like maybe you just haven't got the news bulletin yet. But there's actually a pretty bad dude from Tarshish named Saul. I kind of think we're talking about the same guy here. But what God says next, he says, go. This is like an emphatic. The exclamation is there. You can feel the intensity. Like it's that like the conversation is over. I want you to go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. And this is the thing that is really cool as we start to look at how this story begins is Ananias goes. After he kind of presents this initial concern to God and he gets the go, this man is my chosen instrument, there's no more debate. There's no more arguing. Ananias just goes. And he does exactly what God commands him to do. What happens next is that Saul, who is blind at this point, is healed. Saul repents, he's baptized, and then Saul is ready to go. There is no more delaying for Saul. He is ready to put into action what he has already experienced, what God has been preparing for him to do. He is ready to go. And the next line in verse 20 is, at once, or immediately, at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. Think about this character arc that we've just experienced for Saul. Just a few short chapters ago, we were introduced to Saul not as a good dude, but a guy who is watching Stephen being stoned, and he's excited about it. Awful. But he's excited about it to the next point that after that, he's like, I want to go persecute the church. Now, in chapter 9, Paul has been baptized, and he is like, let me get in front of people because I need to tell them who Jesus is. This is an incredible arc for a character in the story. It's kind of a 0 to 100 situation where Paul is he's ready to go. It's like Bill Cash at 10 p.m. Let's get in the van. We're headed to the beach. That is how Paul responds to this. He is ready to go. He doesn't stop at Buc-ee's. He doesn't even have to fill up his gas tank because he is ready. You're getting onto the road trip metaphors here. And so Paul goes and he begins to preach. And the story continues in verse 23. After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him. But Saul learned of their plan. Day and night they kept close watch on the city gates in order to kill him. But his followers took him by night and lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall. Think about that for just a moment. This is Saul, a powerful, just persecutor of the church. Like how much his life has been transformed up to this point to where Paul now is running away from people trying to kill him. And not only like getting to ride out on a horse, Paul is in a basket. I mean, this is Old Testament-esque of the way that we're saving somebody is lowering them in a basket through an opening in the wall. This would have been Paul lowering himself, humbling himself. But he's like that now because he's experienced Jesus and he's ready to go. He doesn't want to stop. He's going to do whatever it takes to find a way to continue to spread the gospel. And so in verse 26, Paul goes to Jerusalem. We're in Damascus. We go to Jerusalem. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was really a disciple. So think about that for just a moment. You've persecuted the church. You've repented. You've been baptized. You've been preaching to people. Those people, that city decides, hey, you got to get out of here. They're going to kill you. He goes to Jerusalem and he's like, hey guys, I'm ready to share the good news with you. And they're like, no, you're not. We know who you are and we're good. Whatever you're selling, not interested. No solicitation here kind of vibe. So he tries to join them and they won't let him. And here he is here in Jerusalem. So kind of to show you where it is, we've gone from Damascus, now we're down in Jerusalem. And what happens next is actually really cool to me too, because Barnabas shows up. Verse 27, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. Have you ever been in a situation where like you needed somebody to vouch for you? Like you needed somebody just to say, hey, like trust me, this is a good guy. You want to believe them, like they're good, they know what they're talking about. Trust me. That's what Barnabas does. I've said this a lot recently, that time is the most valuable resource that we have. Barnabas takes time out of his day, out of his life, to go and vouch for Paul. Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. Barnabas goes to bat for Saul because he knows that he needs somebody to say, hey, this is who he says he is. I know that you guys don't believe that he's changed, but like I've seen it. I've walked with Saul. I've heard him preach. And I think Barnabas probably said, I even saw how silly he looked when we lowered him down in that basket. Like there was an element of that too where he's like, hey, let me tell you guys where this guy has come from, what he's been through. And so that's where we find ourselves in Acts chapter 9. What happens next in this story is it kind of moves fast. We have some other characters that are introduced. But we eventually find ourselves back in Tarshish. What happens, another cool map, Paul goes from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and he's going to take a boat back to Tarshish. And so in verse 25 and 26, Barnabas went to Tarshish to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. Now, I love pointing this out because we often assume that these biblical characters are living in the same world that we live in today. That for Barnabas to go find Saul would have been as easy as typing his address into the internet, going on whitepages.com. That's not what we're talking about. Seeking somebody out in the ancient world would have took time, it would have took energy, and it would have taken a commitment to actually go find this person wherever they may be. And that's exactly what Barnabas does. And so he's going to take him from Tarshish, and they're going to go to Antioch. Another fun map I present to you. As you can see, the biggest kind of distance that we're looking at is between Caesarea and Tarshish. And so from Tarshish to Antioch, it's not that big of a distance. But it's going to make a huge impact on Paul. Because Paul doesn't just go to Antioch for just a little bit. He's actually going to camp out there. He's going to spend an extended amount of time in Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. This is an insanely important part of Paul's story. Because not only do good things happen here, they start to experience momentum. They not only are doing things, but they are creating an identity of what it looks like to follow Jesus. This past weekend, I spent a little bit of time with Dale White on the Buffalo River. So I'll be taking those man cards back that you guys have taken from me. But while we were hanging out on the Buffalo River, Dale was telling me a lot of stories about life, but also specifically about Chenal. And he was telling me a little bit about how the trailer office back there was built. And if memory is correct, if I remember it exactly how he told me, he said it took about 2 weeks and that whole thing was put up and it was ready to go. But as he was telling me the story of kind of all the things that came together to build that particular office, Dale mentioned that a bunch of people did a bunch of different things. They all had different roles. They all had different responsibilities. They all brought something to the table. And I think he even said that Kent Westbrook would bring sandwiches to people too. Like everybody was involved in this. That is what is happening here at the church of Antioch. For the first time in a lot of these individuals' lives, they feel that they have a larger purpose and meaning to life. And because they have purpose, because they have meaning, they have momentum, and they're like, we've got to call ourselves something to represent the change that we are experiencing. And Luke indicates that this is where the disciples were called Christians first, was at Antioch. But things aren't always going to be good when things are rolling the way that we would want them to. There's just another image of the short distance between Tarshish and Antioch. But the story continues in verse 27. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire world. Only somebody with the name Agabus would be able to be the bearer of such bad news. But Agabus comes up and he's like, hey, the Holy Spirit is leading me to tell you all that something bad is going to happen. That this world, the Roman Empire that we're in right now, is going to experience a famine. Now, this is an early part of the church. It's easy to kind of overlook that detail and kind of think of churches the way that we do today, with buildings, with budgets, all of those things. That's not what we're working with here. These are house churches, probably small groups of people, limited resources, limited funds. And so when Agabus brings this up, this would have been that feeling of, oh no, what do we do? Because yes, they are developing an identity here at this point in the church. But they're not stable enough. There's still a lot of room to grow. There's still a lot of room to improve. And so when Agabus brings this up and he stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire world, we have to ask ourselves, how will the church respond? What will they do? How will they react to something where a large need is needed to help everybody? Says the disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. When I was studying that this week, I kept reflecting on a lot of the stories of how this church began. The stories that I hear from people all the time that I love and I enjoy, but I see that energy in the beginning of this church. Everybody had a role. Everybody had a purpose. Everybody had a responsibility, a skill, a gift, a talent that they brought to the table, and we are still honoring that today. If your gift is doing communion meditations, then yes, absolutely, we're going to sign you up. If your gift is working with children in our children's ministry or making sure that everything's safe outside like Wyatt Lynch is today, we're going to use you based off your skills and your talents and your gifts. And that is a model that we see in the early church that not only created momentum, not only created growth, but also recognized an identity. Because it is in Antioch that they determined that they are Christians, that they are individuals that are following and modeling their lives after Jesus. And they get that way because they're going and they're moving. They're not sitting on their hands saying, okay, what's going to happen next? They are actively in their communities, pouring out to their neighbors, to their friends. They're letting them know, hey, something within me has changed because I've encountered Jesus. In today's world, the way that we do that, I think, is showing kindness and hospitality in ways that the world does not offer anymore. We are so busy as human beings that anytime that we slow down enough to let somebody know, hey, you matter to me. Hey, I'm going to go to bat for you, just like Barnabas did for Saul. When you need me, I'm going to show up. That means so much more than just about anything else that we can do, being willing to show up for someone. And that is a huge marker of the early church here in Acts chapter 11. Willing to show up for people, to give however they can, with what limited resources they have, being willing to say, hey, we need to pull together our resources and make sure that our brothers and sisters in Judea are taken care of, that they have enough to survive because they matter so much to us. And so for a little while in the story, Saul and Barnabas have kind of taken a back seat. We haven't talked about them very much. But in verse 30, this they did. So Luke is confirming that they did pull together their resources. They did gather what they had, and they said, we're going to send a gift. This isn't like a Venmo, a Cash App situation. Like what they have to do is literally take it from point A to point B. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. Years ago in student ministry, one of my favorite things to do when we went to a restaurant was to send in what I would call a tribute. If we ever went somewhere and we had more than 10 or so kids, I didn't want to be the person that went in and said, do you have a table for 12? You're just asking for a disaster. Nobody wants to meet you. And then it's like 10 to 12 teens. And so what I would often do is I would find a kid that I thought would be like a warm, smiling face, a good representation of our group and of our church, and then I would make them go in. And normally they would do it. And so they would often go in and be like, hey, we're here. We would like, 3 tables. If we could put them all together because we've got a group of teens here. And they would reluctantly be like, okay, you can come into the Pizza Hut. But I bring that up because I was intentionally making sure that I sent a good representation into a restaurant or an establishment that we were going to go try to go into with a large group. This is exactly what the early church does in Acts chapter 30. So what I was doing is actually quite biblical, now that I'm reflecting on it in real time. But what the early church does, and it's important that we see this, especially in how we look at Saul and how he develops as a person and as a leader of the early church. Because they could have selected a whole list of different people to go and do this. For all intents and purposes, Agabus is not doing anything else but bringing bad news to people. His schedule is wide open. But what the early leaders do is in Acts chapter 30, they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. They look around and they say, who can we send that we trust, that will be a good representation for our movement, for our identity, that will deliver this gift to people that are in need? They choose Barnabas, they choose Saul. Saul, the very man who in Jerusalem they said, we're good, we don't want to talk to you. We have no interest in you being a part of our movement. In Damascus with Ananias being like, hey God, have you heard about this guy? This is the same individual that eventually takes the gift that this group collects together and sends it to their brothers and sisters in Judea. And I believe the reason why Saul is so willing to do this is because he's ready to go. He knows that following Jesus does not mean sitting idly by and watching things happen. Following Jesus means getting involved and being willing to go and trust that wherever God leads you, God is going to show up and do amazing and beautiful things. But Saul trusts in the Holy Spirit. That's what's guiding Saul. It's not his selfish motivations. It's not the encouragement that he's getting from other people. What is really fueling Saul at this point is that he's being led by the Holy Spirit. And that is the same Spirit that leads us today. And so this week, when you have those opportunities to serve, to give, go. Be encouraged. And if you need somebody to go with you, grab them. Because we all need a friend like Barnabas in our lives that's going to encourage us and support us. And as we move forward into the missionary journeys of Paul, we're going to see different elements of these road trips. Next week is Father's Day. So we're talking about maybe dads who got lost and refused to ask for directions at different places. I'm just saying, we're working with the theme. We're going to go like how difficult it may be when that trip keeps going on and the kids start getting annoying, not me. But those are the elements that we'll look at as we continue to journey through the missionary journeys of Paul. Let's stand and sing together.